So sometimes when you're building a React application, you might use a third-party React component. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, specifically how you can develop and publish your own React component libraries. Now, building a React component library is very different than building a React application in several key ways that we'll be talking about throughout this video. Now, along your journey of developing and publishing your own React component library, you might find that you do things different, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, you might need to do some things that this video doesn't cover. In those cases, you'll need to go into the documentation for the tools that we're using in order to see how to do those particular things. But otherwise, we're going to be doing a pretty general overview of how to develop and publish your React component libraries to the NPM registry. Now, before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Let's go ahead and get started. So in order to get started with creating my React component library, I need to create an empty directory and I need to start setting up my React file structure. Now, I've created a new empty folder called React PWR. And that's going to be the name of my React component library. You'll probably want to name this whatever you are naming your component library. Now, if I ls inside of here, you can see there's absolutely nothing. So we need to get started. I'll run npm init. I'll leave the package name as React PWR. The version, that's fine. Description, I'll go ahead and add that. For the entry point, I'll simply leave it as the index.js file for now. For the author, I'll simply put my name. And for the license, I will put MIT, and this looks good, so I'll type in yes. Now, if I were to ls here, you could see that there's a package.json file, which I want to go ahead and take a look at. So inside of my package.json file, I can see that it pretty much populated all of the information that I put inside of the prompts. So that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and start building my project structure. So I want to have a source folder, and inside of the source folder, I want to have a components folder. And inside of the source folder, I also want an index.js file. I'm going to simply leave these blank for now. I'll come back to those soon, but I want to quickly install a few dependencies. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to run npm install --save dev react and react DOM. Now I'm going to head back to my package.json file, and I see that React and React DOM have been added as dev dependencies. Now, any library that uses this component needs to have React and React DOM installed. If I put them as dev dependencies, it's not going to automatically install it for them. And that's good. We don't want that. It would do that if we listed it as normal dependencies. So if I had React and React DOM listed as normal dependencies, if any project installed my component library, it would install whichever version of React and React DOM I have listed here automatically for them. And we don't want to do that because there could be collisions in versions, and you never want to have multiple versions of React in the same application. However, we do want to make sure that they have React and React DOM installed because this is a React component library. And obviously they need to have React if they're using a React component. So in order to make sure that they have that, we're going to list these as peer dependencies. So I'm simply going to go over to my dev dependencies object. I'm going to copy React and React DOM and paste it into peer dependencies, and then just simply save. So now we have React and React DOM installed. You can go into the node modules folder and see React and React DOM are here. And this is pretty good so far, but I need a way to see the components as I'm developing. As I'm writing the code, I always want to make sure that I can see what it is I'm building as I'm building it so I can test it out and make sure that it's working. One way to do that is to create a new React application that simply installs this locally on my machine. So you have a React application that you create with something like create React app, and then you install this library, for example, React PWR, locally on the machine. However, I would have to constantly rebuild the app every single time I wanted an update, and then I'd have to reinstall on the application that's ingesting this component library, and it can be extremely tedious to do that. So I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to use a tool that makes it as easy as possible for me to develop a component library. And for that, I'm going to use Storybook. And as we can see here, it says Storybook is an open source tool for developing UI components in isolation for React, Vue, Angular, and more. And it is a great tool for this. So if I run over to get started and then go to the install section, I can see this command right here. It says to install Storybook, I can just simply run this command. Now, since we've set up our project structure and have React and React DOM listed as dev dependencies, when I run this command, it should detect that we're inside of a React project, and it should all work automatically. So I'm going to go to my terminal or my command line interface, and I'm going to paste in that npx sb init command. I'm simply going to run it. Now this could take a few minutes, so go ahead and let it finish. Now that that's completed on my end, I'm simply going to scroll all the way up and see that it says detecting project type, and next to that is a check mark, so I know that it successfully determined that we were using a React project. Then I can see below that it lists a few dependencies that it added for us, and then it installed those dependencies, and then it gives us this command that we can run in order to start Storybook. But before I do that, I simply want to go into my project and take a look at some of the things it added for us. So starting in the package.json file, we can see that it did in fact add those dev dependencies that were listed inside of the terminal. It added a empty dependencies object, and two new commands. The first one is Storybook, which is the command it gave us a moment ago. It said npm run Storybook. If we were to run that, it would say start Storybook -p 6006. So it would start a development server up for us and run it on port 6006. The other command it gave us is build Storybook, which is going to allow us to compile the Storybook and deploy it if we want to. Then if we look here on the file system on the left, we can see a new directory called .storybook, and there's some files inside of here, main.js and preview.js, which holds some configuration for our Storybook that we're not going to edit in this video. If I go into my source folder, I can see that it added a new folder called stories, and this is where we're going to put all of our stories. Now, this is not a Storybook tutorial, so I'm not going to go over in great detail what stories are or how stories work, but you can kind of think of them as a way to import your component into Storybook so that you can see it as you're developing it. I'm actually going to delete all of the stories that are inside of here for now, but they are really good for reference. So if this is your first time ever using Storybook, I highly recommend you check out Storybook's documentation, check out the syntax, and take a look at the reference stories that it included for you automatically. Otherwise, you can continue forward with the tutorial and see how we're going to create this library. Now, just to kick things off, I just want to get a basic component set up that has nothing to do with the component that I'm actually building, just to make sure that Storybook is working properly. So I'm going to go into my components folder and create a new folder that I'm going to call requirements. And this is going to end up being my actual component, but for now, I'm just going to write some dummy code inside of it. So I'll create a requirements.jsx file, and I'll export it as a function, and it should just return a little bit of JSX that says hello world. Then inside of my requirements folder, I'm going to create an index.js file that exports this component. Now, inside of my index.js file, I can actually export the component I just created. Now, in a normal React application, the index.js file typically ends up being the file that compiles the entire React application and then injects it into your index.html file. However, when you're building a React component library, there is no index.html file. And so you're not going to be injecting any type of application into any HTML files. So the job of the index.js file inside of a React component library is very different than in a React application. For our case here, what it's going to do is export all of the components that I want any application that may be using this library to be able to import. Now, in my case, for the library that I'm building, I only want them to be able to import one component, and that's the requirements component. And this requirements component is going to use other components, but we're only going to export the requirements component inside of my index.js file. If you're building a component library where you want the applications that are using your library to import all of your components, you're going to want to make sure you export all of them inside of this file. But this is good for me, so I'm going to save and close this file. And I simply just want to run Storybook and see if I can view that component. But in order to do that, I have to create a story for it. So I'm going to create a new file in here called requirements.stories.js. Now there's a few things I need to import inside of here. I need to import React from React, and I also need to import stories of from @storybook/React. Then of course I need to actually import my component. So I can do that by saying import requirements from out of this directory into the components directory into the requirements directory. Then I'm going to create a stories variable using stories of. The context of this is just the app test for me, so I'm just going to leave it as that. Then I need to add this story. So I can say stories.add. I'm going to call the story itself app, and the second argument is a function. Now this function can be thought of as a regular React component, and inside of here I can manage state using useState, and I can use effect, and I can import React components and use React components, and then return JSX like I normally would in a functional component in React. So what that means is I can actually import my requirements component and then render it here. So since my requirements component currently is just a very simple component that says hello world, I just want to return it and see it on the screen to make sure that Storybook is working. I'm simply going to return the requirements component, save it, and let's see if we can run Storybook. npm run Storybook. Okay, it looks like it's compiling, and we should see a browser window pop up in just a second. So now I see a browser window pop up. Currently, I don't see anything on the screen. So the reason why nothing was appearing on the screen was because for some reason, when it opened the browser for me automatically, it was going to 192.168.118, and then the port number 6006. If this happens for you, what you're going to want to do is type in http://localhost:/6006. then when I press enter, I can see the Storybook as I would have expected originally. So just make sure you're on localhost and not an IP address. And now that I'm on there, I can see my app test group and along with my app story, and hello world is rendered. So now I can begin developing my component library and actually see my component on the screen. And you can have a separate story for every single component. However, for me, I'm just gonna have one story because this is really just a single component. But oftentimes you're gonna want to have many stories for every single component that you are going to be allowing the users to use whenever they install your library. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add all of my library code. And since this is not a tutorial on my component library itself, it's how to build and deploy your own, I'm gonna just quickly paste all of my code in, give you a really quick explanation of what it does. And then we're gonna look at it here on the screen, see it working. And then we're gonna talk about how we can build this thing into a dist folder and publish it to NPM. So I've added my code. Let's talk about it really quick. So the requirements component is the component that I'm going to allow people to use whenever they install this library. Then we have requirement, checkmark, and xmark, which are components that the requirements component is going to use. So if I open up the requirements component, I'm going to take a look inside of here and talk about the code really quick. Now the requirements component accepts three props: value, requirements, and on valid change. Value is going to be the value of the password input. Requirements is a list of requirements objects. And then on valid change is called whenever the valid value changes. So if it becomes valid, then it's going to call this callback. If it's invalid, it will then call this callback. Then whenever value or requirements changes, I'm simply updating and calling that callback with the value of valid. Now, each of these requirements has a validator function, so it runs the validator function against the value just to see whether each requirement is valid, and then it returns whether or not all of them are valid. And then what it renders is a list of requirements, and for every requirement, it passes in the value for the input, the requirement object itself, and also it passes down the on valid change handler. Now, this component doesn't currently use the on valid change handler. That's just for me to use later. But this requirement component simply takes the value and the requirement, sets whether or not it is valid. If it is valid, it renders a check mark. If it's not valid, it renders an X mark. And then on the right side of that, it renders the text for the validation. You'll see that on the screen in just a moment. Then the X mark and check mark are simply SVG components that render a nice looking SVG for an X and a check mark. So my component library is complete. I want to go ahead and update my story so that I can see it on the screen rendered properly. Now, obviously, in your case, you're going to be updating your story while you're developing the library. But since I already had all the code written, I'm simply doing it this way. So the first thing I need to do is import use state, and I'm going to add 3 pieces of state here at the top of my story: valid, password, and username. Then I need to create a list of password requirements. So I'll paste that below here. And these password requirements contain both a text and a validator. That validator is that function that checks the value against a function that makes sense for the validation. So for example, must be at least 8 characters. We're just checking that the length is greater than or equal to 8. And then we're just doing the same thing for these 3 validations as well. Then finally, for my return statement, I'm returning a form with a header and the requirements component with the props that it expects, 2 inputs, one for the username, one for the password, and then a sign up button. And if I save it, let's take a look at the Storybook. So as it refreshes, we can see that I forgot to add the styles. For my story, we can actually use CSS in our stories. Then I need to make sure to import it. And then I also forgot one more thing, which was to add a styles.css file at the root level. It contains all of the styles for my component library. So once I add those, if I go back here, we can see my sign up form. Now it says must be at least 8 characters, must contain at least 1 number, must contain at least 1 lowercase letter, and must contain at least 1 uppercase letter. So if I go into my password input and begin fulfilling these requirements, you can see that it updates as I fulfill them. So it should update as soon as I reach 8 characters. Now that I've fulfilled all 4 of these requirements, they're all green with check marks next to them. And as I backspace and remove letters and characters from my password, you can see that it's updating live. So it makes it really easy for users to be able to fulfill their password requirements without them having to memorize each one and then get frustrated when they try to submit it, and then it tells them after they submit it. So this is looking good. This is behaving as I would want it to. Now the question is, how can I build this into a dist folder that I can then publish to NPM? And the answer to that is we're going to be using Rollup for that. Now let's take a quick look at Rollup's website. You can see that it says Rollup is a module bundler for JavaScript which compiles small pieces of code into something larger and more complex, such as a library or application. So a lot of people who are building React component libraries use Rollup because of how convenient it is over something like Webpack. So again, this isn't a Rollup or a Storybook tutorial. If you'd like me to do tutorials on Storybook or Rollup, Rollup, just let me know in the comments. But I will be going over how to set up Rollup and how I'm using it for this component library. But if you're trying to do something more complex, you'll probably want to read through this documentation and just get an idea of how all of this is working. So in order to get started, I need to install Rollup and I need to install some plugins. And these plugins are going to do things that make my life a lot easier, and I'll explain what each of them are doing. But first, let's just go ahead and install all of this. So in my terminal, I'm pasting this line here. We have npm install rollup. Then we have rollup plugin Babel. Then we have rollup plugin node resolve, rollup plugin peer deps external. And then we're saving these all as dev dependencies. Let's go ahead and install those. And you may need more or less of these depending on your particular use case. So let's talk about what each of these are and what they do. And then in a moment, we'll talk about how to use them. So the first one here is plugin node resolve. And what this is it's going to resolve third-party modules in case you're using any third-party dependencies. So if you're using any third-party dependencies in your React library, it's going to resolve those and add it to the source code. Then we have Rollup, which is the library itself, which obviously you need in order for all of this to be working initially anyway. Then we have Rollup plugin Babel. This allows you to integrate with the existing Babel config, and we have Babel core and Babel loader, and we're going to actually install a Babel config in just a moment. We'll get to that in just a second though, but this plugin is basically going to allow us to use that Babel plugin with Rollup very easily. And then finally here we have Rollup plugin peer deps external, and this just ensures that we exclude any peer dependencies from our bundle, and we have React and React DOM as peer dependencies. We want to make sure that we do not add the React and React DOM source code to our bundle. So the Babel plugin that I was talking about is Babel preset React. I'm going to go to the beginning here and type in npm install -- save dev. So I want to install as a dev dependency this Babel preset React Babel plugin. So I'm going to just quickly install that, and this is going to handle JSX for us and other React goodies. And now I can see Babel preset React as a dependency to the project, specifically a dev dependency. Okay, now how to put all of this into practice? Well, in order to get started with Rollup, we just need to create a new file at the root level called rollup.config.js. First thing I want to do is to import my plugins that I installed just a moment ago. So we have Babel, resolve, and external. And then I need to export a default variable, which I'm going to make as an array. And we're going to put an object in this array, which is going to be our configuration for our rollup. Now the input is going to be what is the entry point for the application. In my case here, it's /source/index.js. Then we're going to have the same thing for output. We want to be able to output all of our files to a particular directory. Now I'm going to be outputting for both common.js and also ES modules, but you may only want to export to ES modules or maybe UMD or common.js. Read up on all of those things. Be familiar with those things if you are building a React library. In my case, I'm just going to be exporting as common.js and ES modules. So I can set output to an array, and for each item in this array is going to be configuration for each type of output. The first one is going to be my common.js format. So I'm going to set the file, and the file name is going to end up just simply being dist/index.js, and the format is CJS, which just stands for common.js. Then the second object is going to be my configuration for the ES modules. So we'll set the file, which will be dist/index.es/js. Then we're going to have the format set to ES. And finally, I'm going to set exports to be named because I'm using named exports. After the output array, I can add all my plugins, and that's going to be an array as well. And currently I have 3. I have Babel, resolve, and external. I'm going to add them here. So we'll start with Babel, and these are going to be functions. I'm going to pass in an object to my Babel function, and we're going to add an exclude. And I want to make sure that I exclude node modules from my Babel compilation. And I'm going to set presets to an array. And remember that preset that we installed just a moment ago? We're going to put that in here at Babel/preset-react. Now after Babel, I'm going to go ahead and set up external. This doesn't take any arguments, and I'm going to add resolve as well, which will also take no arguments, and save it. Now if I go over here, I can see this is my current structure. There's a source folder, a node modules folder, and a storybook folder. When I run Rollup, I am hoping to see a new folder called dist, which will contain both the index.js file and the index.es.js file, which will be the compiled version of the application that other React applications will be able to import and use. But in order to run Rollup, I actually need to add a command for Rollup. So I'm going to go to my package.json file, go to my scripts object, and add a new script that I'm just going to call build library or build lib for short. And this command is going to run rollup. So we're going to run rollup-c. Now we have rollup installed. It's a dependency of the project. So it's going to run that whenever we run build lib. So I'll save it and let's see what happens when I try to run npm run build lib. See what happens. All right, it says unexpected token. Note that you need plugins to import files that are not JavaScript. So this is actually because I'm using CSS throughout the application. I need to make sure that I have the post CSS plugin installed. So I need to add that really quick. So I'll simply clear this out and run npm install -- save dev rollup plugin post CSS. I'll press enter, let that install. Cool, that finished up and I need to add it to my config. So I'll add that right here. And then I need to add it to my array of plugins. I'll add it at the very beginning. Now this is going to take an argument with some config in here. I'll set plugins to an empty array and I'll set minimize to true. All right, let's see what happens now when I run npm run build lib. Cool, it says that it was successful, so let's take a look and see what it generated for us. There's a dist folder now, and inside of here is both an index.js and an index.es.js. If I open it, we can see that it is a large JavaScript file which contains the React components that I created in my project. Now, if we look, the only thing that I'm exporting is requirements. So that is looking like I would expect. However, what I'm not really liking is that I really want to minify this because there's no reason for the JavaScript to look pretty like this. I would rather it be as small as possible so that we can save file size. So I'm actually going to add one more plugin. And the plugin is going to be Terser. So npm install save dev rollup plugin Terser. Once that installs, I'll go back to my rollup config and paste in the import for Terser. Notice that it is not a default import. Make sure you destructure it. And I need to just go to the very bottom of my plugins array and add Terser. Click save, go back to my terminal, clear this out, and then I'm going to run npm run build lib. Now let me have a look at that index.js file and notice that it's minified now. So the file size is going to be much smaller, and the same for my ES. Okay, so now we have the library built. It's in the dist folder. We're able to develop using Storybook and build using Rollup. The only thing left is to publish this to the NPM registry. Now, in order to do that, you have to have an account with the NPM registry. So you need to go to npmjs.com, sign up for an account, make sure that you have an account there. And once you have an account, then you'll be able to publish your library. But make sure that your library has a unique name. So do a search, make sure that the package name that you're using does not already exist. You can go to your package.json file and go to the top and find the name here. And you can actually rename your project if necessary, if your package already exists. For me, I'm just going to append port.exe to the front just because I would rather be a little bit more specific in case someone else wants to create the React PWR library. And for this is really just a tutorial for me, so I don't want to hog up that name. So I'm going to save this. And in order to publish this, I need to make sure that I have my NPM linked to my account. The easiest way to link it is to go to your terminal or your command line and type in npm login. Then it's going to ask you your username and then your password. Then you can set your email if you'd like. Make sure you go through that login process. Once you're logged in and you have everything connected, before we publish this, let's go back to our package.json file and make sure that our main right here, we have a main. It needs to be dist/index.js. However, we also have the modules. So I'm going to add a new one called module, new property called module, and it's going to be the exact same thing, except it's going to have that .es file extension with it. So we need to be referencing the index.js inside of our dist folder and not the one in our source folder. So once I've added those, I can go to my command line and type in npm publish. And now what it's doing is it is publishing my component library. It says that it worked. So I'm going to go back over here, go to my profile, refresh packages. It says I have a package. It's not showing it right now, but I can search for it. port.exe-react PWR. It's right here. So when I click it, it takes me to the page and now I can see that my library is live and any application that wants to install this can simply run npm install port.exe-react PWR. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something, and hopefully I'll get to use your component libraries in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video.